Hello everybody and welcome to the long-awaited Ilford Delta 100 Professional, all about film. This video looks at Ilford Delta 100 Professional film, how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, and provides a copious number of sample images to illustrate how it performs. Delta 100, as we'll call it in this video, is a medium-speed film available in most every known film format. Standard formats include 35mm in both preloaded cassettes as well as bulk spools, 120, all of the standard sheet film sizes, and then most if not all of the obscure sheet film sizes during Ilford's annual ultra-large format ordering period. One of the things Ilford really does as a company is they go to a lot of trouble to properly rate their films at and provide that as the box speed. Delta 100 can be overexposed a good deal, and I liked it when I experimented with it at 400. In fact, as a 400 ISO film, I think that it yields images which are simply stunning and better than most 400 ISO native rated films on the market. But that said, Delta 100 is rated at 100 by ISO, and that is a very good rating for this film. For filters, in select settings, I found that a red filter worked, and that those select settings were basically with pinhole cameras and ultra-long exposures, as well as when the horizon and the distance blended into the distant haze of clouds or mountains. In shadowed settings, very surprisingly, purple filters controlled contrast well. Beyond that, I really saw no reason to slap any extraneous glass in front of the lens with Delta 100, as it performs beautifully in all of the other lighting situations I used it in. I most enjoyed shooting Delta 100 in 35mm and sheet film, especially 8x10. For absolutely no justifiable reason, I was fairly indifferent to Delta 100 in both 120 and 4x5, but on the extreme ends of my shooting formats, it was great. The results in both 120 and 4x5 were great, but I just never gravitated to Delta 100 when I was picking up a 120 or a 4x5 camera. No reason why, it's just how it was. The best tip that I have for you with Delta 100 is to expose, especially in high contrast settings, to your shadows and do highlight recovering with slow, dilute developing, and contrast reducing filters if you print on an enlarger. If you digitize with a DSLR for raw editing, that technique, that digitization technique, will allow you to recover almost any highlights in your raw editor. For preferred subjects, I found no subjects whatsoever that Delta 100 didn't handle exceptionally well. If you want Delta 100 to be your only film, you will find yourself really wanting for nothing unless you have a need for an ultra-fast film. So the grain is there, sure, but it so well complements the images that Delta 100 captures that I can't envision this film without it. An important note here, Ilford recommends DDX or Perceptol for finest image grain. I tried neither of those developers, but I will say that I have trouble imagining this film with finer grain. Tonality and tonal range consistently exceeded my expectations, and my expectations were high for this film. The acutance that this film provides is very complementary to the image aesthetic and provided clear tonal transitions without any overly sharp appearances. Contrast was well retained, or at worst, exceptionally recoverable in post. Even images on the flatter end of this video had good contrast after some fairly minimal post work. Sharpness depends on the developer, and Ilford recommends HC at dilution B, which is 1+31, or ID11, which is also the same as D76, at 1+3 for maximum sharpness. I used Legacy Pro 110, which is the generic equivalent of HC, and D76, which I believe is chemically the same as ID11, and at both of those concentrations. And I concur that those yielded maximum sharpness with Delta 100. The dynamic range, which is shown on the datasheet as the characteristic curve, is generally flatter than many films in this video series, and it works well with this stock's overall characteristics to create images with recoverable tonal range and great detail. Digital conversion for Delta 100 is absolutely superb. The negatives, especially with a raw workflow, provide amazing results. Now that said, if you use a scanner and have access to a high-res TIFF workflow, you can expect similar editability and results. The spectral sensitivity curve is used to describe the film's relative sensitivity on the y-axis to visible light colors on the x-axis. So here's some things that I want you to pay attention to in this curve, because it's a lot different, at least as I recall, to any of the other curves we've seen in this series. The peak around 550 nanometers means that this film sees and records green lights very well, or green shades and tones very well. The second thing is there is a slightly lower and shorter peak that around 625 nanometers, and that aligns with the orange tones that this film sees. Okay, so third thing, given that humans see green most easily, and that our brains are attuned to see orange very easily, this film has a look that closely replicates how our brains perceive tones. So even though the human eye doesn't see orange nearly as well as it sees green, our brains hone in on warm tones like orange and red and yellow, because generally speaking, those things are either going to be food, like apples and bananas and raspberries, or danger, like poisonous frogs. So our brains see green really well and perceive oranges really well. And that's replicated in the way that this film records light. So one thing for the next section, which is filter performance, is I want you to pay attention to the images that were recorded with the green filter. One thing specifically, there's a shot of some trees, some forest going out to some mountains. And interestingly, in that shot, there is much more gradation in the greens than in any of the other shots. And that filter really brought out the most of what this film can do when a green filter is used on it. The reason for that is because of that flatness at the 550 range. So if you think about, if you hike a mile, let's say, and you go up and down 2 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet, whatever it is, just a few times, if you plot that on a chart, it's gonna look like a really steep up and down if that chart has the same height as, say, a mile-long hike where you climb 1,000 feet and go back down. So both of those, if they have the same height, are going to look like they're equivalently steep. So if you take that flatness along 550 of the green tones and you get rid of everything else, now what the green filtration does with this film is it amplifies the slight variations in that spectral sensitivity and makes them more dramatic. So that's what's going to happen when we see what the green filter does.
Find something true that I like. I won't stress you, dear. I know that you made up your mind. Pretending that nothing has changed. Time is my only escape. I know that I lost you that night. I know that you've already left.
Quick note, these shots were taken on the second set of filters that I bought for those of you who have been tracking the drama of my filters. And this second set does perform much better than the first set that I bought. So I think that confirms it, that again, everyone's favorite online megastore sold me some subpar at best photo gear. For this test, the filters that I used were, and in the order you'll see the images in, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, tobacco, pink, and purple. So the series that you're seeing will start with no filter, and then we'll have all the filters, and it's labeled for ease of following. Now, as a general observation, a warm tone filter with Delta 100 will, per normal, amplify some tonality in the skies. Two filters of note as interesting with this film are the green and the purple. Each have a very specific and, insofar as I could tell, singular ideal use situation, while the green maybe has two. We'll get to that right now. For green, if you have a large swath of green in your images, like a forest, especially in a valley, then you can increase the tonal separation within those trees at the cost of any kind of sky detail or distant tonal recession. Green is also one of those filters that works very well for portraits, especially for people with lighter skin tones. So a portrait shot in a grassy field could be a fantastic use with this film for a green filter. Now, purple also surprised me because I generally think of it as being functionally useless on black and white. However, with Delta 100, it removed a lot of the detail loss in shadows with harsh lighting. So, if you were doing a shoot in deep shade in an otherwise sunny setting, and especially if you had some light peeking into your shade, a purple filter could really help you increase your shadow detail retention. The datasheet also notes one other thing that's very important. In the winter months, green and blue filter colors may underexpose your images because winter light has a warmer cast. And so that's important because that effect is due to the color temperature of the light, not the amount of light. And what that means is that if you have a TTL light meter on your camera, it's not going to adjust the meter reading automatically for the time of year. So if you're using cool tone filters in the winter, just be sure to overexpose your images, a stop or stop and a half, something like that. Per norm with Ilford, anything faster than 1/10,000th of a second requires an added third or half stop of exposure, or aperture rather, compensation for reciprocity. Slow speed reciprocity correction begins at a full second, again, which is normal for Ilford. And again, normal for Ilford, no developing compensation rather, is needed with Delta 100 for long exposures, or at least it wasn't mentioned in the datasheet. So here's the reciprocity chart as you're seeing right now. To read this chart, your metered time is along the bottom. So if your camera says you need 10 seconds, that's the bottom row of numbers. And then your actual time is on the left column. So let's say that your camera says you need that 10-second exposure. Well, you can see you actually need to take a 20-second exposure. Now that that's down pat, if you're using a pinhole camera, let's say, and you need a metered 50-second exposure. Take a second, how long would you actually need? If you said 140 seconds, you'd be correct. Ilford recommends developing Delta 100 at, no shock here, 100 ISO for best results. And to that point, as I've said in previous Ilford videos, and I assume we'll say in future Ilford videos, they go to great lengths to properly box rate their film, and I think that they are the best filmmaker in that regard. The datasheet notes that pulling or pushing one stop can be done. The massive development chart, as being the Wild West of film developing that it is, has times for Ilford Delta 100 from a ludicrous 10 to an absolutely bonkers 1250 ISO. Now, there are only two 10 ISO sample times and then one 1250 ISO sample time. As a side note, I have to guess that whoever submitted the 1250 time was looking at the massive development chart one day, saw that there were no times faster than 800 and said, you know what? I'm going to be the guy who submits the fastest time for Delta 100. Oh, yes. And that's probably how it came to be. I personally shot Delta 100 from 10 ISO to 400 ISO. Now, after having just railed on everyone who's been shooting it at 10, I want to note I only did it at 10 ISO because I had the camera's ISO dial set wrong. Oops. I only intentionally pulled Delta 100 to 25 ISO. At 400, I really liked Delta 100 in D76+3. I think that Delta 100 has potential for use as a low-grain 400 ISO film. In all, I tried 21 film sensitivity developer combinations with Delta 100. And that's largely because I shot a lot of this stock in the year before we moved to Colorado, when I was using what chemistry I had on hand so that I could move less stuff. In a turn that will shock all this video series fans, Ilfosol 3 at 1+14 is probably the best developer. Rodinal plus 100 for stand developing came in a close second. And I would note that I only used Rodinal stand developing with sheet film for this, and I would recommend that if you try that, to do a few agitations about one every 20 minutes during the process to avoid uneven developing, which my 8x10 sheets exhibited in this video. Coming in third, and again close on the heels of the other two, and quite surprisingly to me, was Fomadon LQP plus 10. And it's a staggeringly good chemistry with this film. And as a side note, the only film I've so far used LQP on and not liked it is Foma 400. It's so weird. In general, Delta 100 responds well to different film developers, and there's a pretty narrow floor and ceiling with chemistry response with this film. That said, a few standouts warrant avoidance. For you vintage chemistry buffs, DK50+3 didn't look too good with some muddy and mushy results. Now that said, I used that on 35mm only, so I do think that in controlled lighting, with a portrait subject and a sheet film format, that DK50+3 could work. DK50 is, after all, a developer well suited for portraits once it's been broken in. A close second was D76+3 when the film was exposed specifically at 50 ISO. No specific reasons here, the negatives just kinda sucked. And rounding out the worst three, TMax developer 1+4 bumped up the contrast at the cost of highlight and shadow detail retention. Though I couldn't find any online samples of Delta 100 that I could definitively say were developed in TMax developer, my experience, admittedly limited, with it leads me to believe that it would likely not work well until the dilution is pretty significant. So if I were going to try TMax developer with Delta 100 again, I would not try anything less dilute than 1+9. I often find myself asking, when making these videos, what makes a good film? Or what makes a film good? Or some other variation of that question. Often I ask if this film that I'm working with in this video, or the specific video I'm asking the question about, is a good film. And we can acknowledge that with some infrequent exceptions, film today is very good, and I think that this video series shows that. And that, frankly, blows my mind, since the industry today has been almost 20 years with far less new engineering and research talent influx than it had prior to digital. So that we have good films at all speaks quite highly of the talented engineers and chemists involved with film production today. The best evidence of that is the near uniform quality of black and white 100 ISO film stocks. Literally none of the 100 ISO black and white films being made today are bad, or even poor, or really even below average compared to historic films. Even the worst of them, whatever that film is, and I don't know which one it is yet, performs better than very many, if not all, historic comparable films. But here's the thing, Delta 100, it's not the worst of them. So what is it that makes modern 100 ISO black and white films good? They perform well, meaning they excel in the important technical ways: consistency, uniformity across batches, performance and image characteristics that yield pleasing images, and an ability to be used flexibly across settings, conditions, and subjects to capture captivating images. Delta 100 ticks all those boxes. More than that, I know of no one who has used Delta 100 and come away from the experience with it being anything less than a favorite film. And that, I'm going to argue, is because in every possible way that a 100 ISO film could be measured, barring perhaps cost, Ilford Delta 100 meets or beats all the competitors. And yes, this is, insofar as I know, the single best in production 100 ISO black and white film, today, and frankly any day. If I met a time traveler from the future who came back just to buy Delta 100 because no better 100 ISO black and white film exists in the future, I'd believe them when they told me that. I can think of no way to improve this film class, which is 100 ISO black and white films writ large, beyond what Delta 100 today is. I think that the highest praise that I can pay Delta 100 is that it is, in every format, the single best 100 ISO black and white film. And its latitude to be pushed up to 400 ISO quite easily with phenomenal results, and to be pulled as slow as 10 ISO with still very good results, makes it a fantastic all-around film as well. And one quick thing, when I say it can be pushed to 400 ISO, what I mean is that at 400 ISO, Delta 100 performs better than very many native 400 ISO black and white films being made today. So in my frame of reference, Delta 100 is not simply the best 100 ISO black and white film being made today or ever. It is the best black and white film of any ISO being made today or ever.